kind of angle. You want the big
Yeah, that's
bird
pretty
up
cool.
there? My hawk.
Yeah, that hawk is incredible. It's taxidermied. What is
Yeah.
it? Is it actually called Diaz Pelech or that's Dr. S. Pelech? Oh, okay.
Oh, actually, what that is that's carved. One of my graduate students, when she was in Indonesia,
Hmm.
gave it back to me as a gift, and it's a carved. I don't know if you can see it up there, but this has actually got a big dragon on the front of it.
Oh, wow.
So it's all hand carved, and then with my name. And so she gave it to me as a gift.
That's
So
dope. You have some
well, I
loving
just put it up
students.
there because I don't know where else to put it.
Yeah, so people that don't know, you're a university professor, right?
Yes.
At the University of British Columbia, yes?
Yep. I've been on faculty at UBC now for at least 34 years. Uh,
Incredible.
Full professor, and I've also run two biotech companies at the same time. So first, Conitec Pharmaceuticals. That was a company which I started that I was the president for 6 years, and it was involved in drug discovery for inhibitors of protein kinases. Turns out to be a really big area in the pharmaceutical industry now. I think
Mm,
about a third of all research and development for drugs, especially for cancer treatment, are actually kinase inhibitors.
mm,
And then I started Connexus about 22 years ago. And we've been doing research for companies in that for, again, facilitate drug discovery for protein kinases in particular. But we also, for the last 2.5 years, have been conducting this clinical study to
mhm,
look at antibody levels for SARS-CoV-2
mm.
antibodies in people. And I've been leading that study. We've had 4,000 participants now measuring their antibody levels. And to cut to the chase, pretty much everybody that we measure antibodies for nowadays has antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and not just the spike protein, which would come from the vaccines, because we have about 85% of Canadians have been vaccinated now, double vaccinated, but in fact, against the other SARS-CoV-2 proteins. So that
Mm.
basically means either they got vaccinated and didn't need to because they already had natural immunity, or they got vaccinated and it didn't work and they got infected anyways. And now have the antibodies they really need, which is the from natural immunity.
And you were telling me last conversation we had that you were actually doing these antibody tests before the rollout of the injections.
Oh yeah, no, we started these studies in March of 2020, and even at that time, 90% of the people we tested had antibodies against the virus in the Vancouver area, and it was kind of like a bit of a mystery because officially the pandemic didn't really start in British Columbia until like mid March, but in reality, it completely wrong for a number of reasons. Originally, they thought it was this because when they did gene sequencing, they could see that the variant that was present at the time they started these genetic sequencing programs, CanCod gene, that it looked like the strain actually came from Europe, not directly from Wuhan. However, we now know that when you look at these strains, these variants that emerged that are variants of concern, we had the Wuhan, then it was alpha, beta, gamma, and then we got to Omicron, and now with Omicron we have all these subvariants. They can displace each other within a couple of months. So
Mm,
I think what happened was the version that spread through Europe from China then came here. It supplanted the version that we already had here, which was directly from China. And in people that we test, when we ask them, well, when were you sick with COVID like 19 symptoms? And 3/4 of all the people that we've tested, and that's the first time they ever recall having the symptoms of COVID 19, is in December of 2019, January and February and March. 3/4 of all of our participants. So the virus hit BC very early on. We think that probably went for about 3 to 4 months without any restrictions. A lot of people got sick. We didn't equate it to COVID-19. And I think what's happened is a lot of people developed natural immunity during that period of time. And there are the natural immunity we see can last for at least 2 years, that they clearly have antibody levels. But what we did see is that many of the people that were sick in the first wave did get sick about 2 years later, probably because, and this is my hypothesis, that they may have reduced their natural immunity by getting vaccinated. And also there was enough change.
Oh, your sound is cut out. Hello, hello. Check, check, check. Yep. Hey, man, can you hear me? I can't hear you. This keeps happening. Every conversation we have gets froze. Yeah, there you are again.
Okay.
I remember the first conversation we had, you started talking about India and the treatments that they used that were effective there, and the sound cut out moments after that too. And then the Zoom interview wasn't recorded, even though I had recorded it. And then, I don't know if you know, but our interview was banned off of YouTube. But I'm sure you're not surprised by that.
I'm not surprised.
Please go on, though.
AI is getting better and better.
Yeah, I think it's totally, I was saying to my friend last night, I think it's up and running, man.
Yeah.
Overtime.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that in terms of the infection, the virus, that I think what's happened is a lot of people have gotten reinfected again because the virus has mutated. Fair amount, although still antibodies that you have against the original Wuhan strain are still actually good today. But what does happen is if you isolate yourself, even though this is a very infectious virus, you will have a decline in your antibody levels. And it takes time for your immune system to reactivate itself to produce antibodies. And so in that period of time, there's an opportunity for that virus to actually replicate enough to have to then stimulate your immune system to have its symptoms, right? Because when you get COVID-19, that everything you feel pretty much is from your immune system. It's not from the virus. With your immune system, your temperature goes up because your immune system is more active. You have the achiness because you have the inflammation where the white blood cells are traveling to the site where the virus is, or in the case of a vaccine injection, where the vaccine is. And so all of these symptoms that one has from COVID-19, at least early on, is the same symptoms that you get when you're vaccinated. And in some people, the vaccine adverse effects are as much or greater than what you see from the virus itself in people. You know, like most children that are infected have no symptoms with COVID-19. You know, actually, COVID-19 is a disease, but the virus, they have no symptoms from infection with SARS-CoV-2. And that's the vast majority of young people. As you get older, we tend to show the illness, but again, in most people and in many adults, it's still asymptomatic, no symptoms. Whereas 70% plus of people who are vaccinated, and the more you're vaccinated, the more likely that you're actually going to have side effects that will prevent you from, working for a couple of days from the vaccine. And of course, we're now seeing that it's actually more dangerous. In fact, I got to tell you, Nathan, about this study that I just read the other day. It's the most, I would say, shocking data that I've seen so far with respect to the vaccine program and the risks to young males. So this is a study that came out of the BC Centre for Disease Control. And it was actually a fairly nicely done study. They had a lot of cases of myocarditis that they tracked. And their question was, was there in fact an increased risk with myocarditis through the population at different ages and different, genders, sex, I should say. And then what happened was they found that the data they had was actually much worse than what we had thought before. So there's been a number of publications that suggest that if you're a male that's between 12 to 24, your chances of myocarditis, symptomatic myocarditis, that is, that you actually will be ill and probably go to the hospital, is about 1 in 5,000 in that range. Sometimes it was less, around 1 in 3,000 with the Moderna sometimes, and a little less of a risk, but around 1 in 5,000 to 6,000 with the Pfizer vaccine, these RNA vaccines. And that seemed to be acceptable. I mean, frankly, if I saw risks like that if you're to vaccinate healthy people that are very unlikely that even if they got COVID to be more than like have bad case of the flu or a cold, to take and subject them to a vaccine that can give you that kind of a risk, that's just not acceptable by normal standards. But it has been. And put it in perspective, for example, AstraZeneca vaccine for COVID-19, after it was found that about 1 in 55,000 people get thrombosis with that vaccine, they no longer offered it in Ontario. And yet here in the rest of the country, including BC, 1 in 5,000 risk for 12 to 24-year-olds was acceptable. Now, here's the thing. This study that just came out basically shows that if you're between 12 to 29 years of age, your chances of getting symptomatic myocarditis with the second shot and you're a male is about 1 in 500. 1 in 500. Tenfold lower than what we thought it was before. And if you get your third shot, the risk goes down with Moderna because the risk is much higher with your second shot. But with your third shot with the Pfizer, it goes up. And in fact, not only does it go up in the 12 to 29-year-olds, but it goes up in all the other age brackets with males with a third shot. So again, we're talking about symptomatic myocarditis. Now that will manifest itself because a person has been very physically active to the point where now they require that heart extra, beating of the heart, the blood pressure, and that just precipitates the attack. However, asymptomatic myocarditis, where the same underlying damage is occurring, is actually, you may not know that your heart has been basically infiltrated by immune cells that have been attacking and killing your cardiomyocytes, your heart muscle cells. And it will heal, not by replacing them with healthy muscle cells, but with scar tissue. And your heart will get a little bit bigger by the remaining muscle cells. Just like you're exercising, your muscles, you don't increase the number, they increase in the size of those cells. So your heart compensates, gets bigger. And that when you exert yourself, you have more blood pressure and more chances of actually getting arteriosclerosis or arrhythmia of the heart. So it's a long-term prospect for heart disease, which is, after cancer, the number 2 killer in Canada and United States. Now, here's the thing. For every case of symptomatic myocarditis, we think there's 3 cases of asymptomatic myocarditis. So now we're talking about vaccinating 12 to 29-year-olds, where they probably have a chance that's closer to 1 in 100 to 1 in 150 of getting myocarditis. Now, that study doesn't include what we call myopericarditis. So the myocarditis is the muscle cells in the heart, but in the tissue surrounding the heart, that holds the heart in shape, the pericardium, you also have a risk of myocarditis, of this myopericarditis. So when you add those risks in with the myocarditis risks, you're certainly looking at less than 1 in 100 chance of that person developing, that male, developing myocarditis. Now, females are at lower risk, but it's only about 5-fold lower. So in reality, we're taking these young people, especially your age, going to universities, and we're requiring them to get vaccinated if they decide that they want to go into the health profession. So if you're going to be in a medical school, you're going to be in nursing, you're going to be a dentist, it's a requirement that you must be vaccinated here in British Columbia. And so we're taking these people and we're subjecting them into what is basically a high risk of a life-altering, a treatment that, in fact, they don't actually need in the first place. And they're not particularly transmissible. And now, 3 years into the pandemic, most people have natural immunity anyways. So there's no compelling reason to get these vaccines. So this is sort of where the situation is kind of evolved to. The virus is less deadly. The vaccines are showing more and more to have a high degree of injury. If you take all of the reports of vaccine injury in the US Vaccine Adverse Effects Reporting System, VAERS, or the VIGI Access System, the World Health Organization, and you take all of the vaccines put together in the last 30 years, there is more injury reports and hospitalizations and deaths with the COVID vaccines than all the other vaccines put together. And that's really illustrating how dangerous the RNA vaccine technology is. And now we're talking about using that same technology for routinely using in other types of vaccines now. So this is where we're at. It's just incredible.
So you must be privy to B36, Bill B36, which was
Oh yeah, that's another disaster in the making, because now the same people that are advising us to get vaccinated and wear masks that are completely ineffective are now going to be telling doctors what to do with these colleges all being consolidated and under better control of the government. And that's just a recipe for disaster, because if this is how they've handled the situation with COVID-19, I shudder to think how much worse it's going to get. I mean, Nathan, I bet you have no idea of, when you're vaccinated, how many lipid nanoparticles you're actually vaccinated with a single injection. I bet you most of your audience doesn't know. Yeah. And so here's the answer. I couldn't believe it. I actually calculated this myself. And it works out to, in my case, with a Moderna shot, 100 micrograms of the RNA, that works out to about, in my calculation, 80 trillion nanoparticles per injection. Now, your body has around 50 trillion cells. So you have a nanoparticle for every cell of your body. And they're all being injected into your arm into one place. But within 2 days, it's spread throughout the rest of your body. And they're producing, when these nanoparticles, they're not targeted. They actually will fuse with any cell that they come in contact with and deliver their contents, which in this case is the RNA, to make the spike protein of the virus. And so what's happening is there's about 5 to 10 copies in each nanoparticle of the gene to make the spike protein. So we're talking about making potentially hundreds of trillions of copies, if they all worked, of the spike protein on your body cells, which then elicits an immune response where your own immune system attacks those body cells in order to then be able to produce antibodies against the spike protein. So, well, how does that compare with a normal vaccine? Well, normal vaccines use typically attenuated forms of these viruses that are weakened. So your immune system still gets educated about them to make antibodies, but the virus propagates very slowly. So you're typically getting with a vaccine hundreds to thousands of copies of that virus that's attenuated. And that, for most people, can give them immunity for the rest of their life. But with these vaccines that are RNA vaccines, again, we're not talking about hundreds or thousands of copies. We're talking about tens of trillions of copies. I mean, so you ever wonder why is it that people, when they're first vaccinated, why is it that they actually have an increased risk of getting COVID-19? And it always bugged me. Well, why is that? How does that work? Why would you, if you've just been vaccinated, be more likely to get COVID in the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks, right? This is why many of the statistics on vaccination and its effectiveness, they always refer to someone who's been vaccinated and gets COVID in the first 2 weeks. They call them unvaccinated, and they put them in with the unvaccinated category, and it skews the data. But here's the explanation. If you've got a pandemic going on and the virus is in the environment, and you've just injected yourself with these lipid nanoparticles, and they're producing tens of trillions of copies of the spike protein on the surface of your own body cells, whatever immunity you have at that time is focused on that spike protein, which is the major protein on the surface of the virus. So when a virus comes in through your nasal passages or your mouth or your eyes, and it's in the upper lungs, well, it turns out that the antibodies that you're producing, the vaccine, IgG class antibodies, are at low concentrations in those spaces. If you were infected previously and you develop natural immunity, you have an IgA or IgM antibodies, and these are secreted into those spaces and they fight the virus as soon as it comes. So you got your immune system when you're just vaccinated. If you get infected with the virus, you actually have very little protection and your immune system is distracted. It's actually taking on the spike protein elsewhere in the body where it thinks the infection is greater and ignoring in your nasal passages and airways the virus, which then propagates in those places. And then you can transmit the virus. So this is why people who are vaccinated can still get COVID just as likely as someone who's unvaccinated. They can still transmit, if they have COVID, the virus with the same kind of viral loads, if that's their first time. Of course, if you've already have natural immunity, then your ability to fight the virus is much better, and you don't secrete and you're not as infectious. So this is where natural immunity has it over vaccine-induced immunity, hands down. But during the period that you're vaccinated, the first 2 weeks, you're more likely to get COVID. You have a period of protection while those antibodies levels go up, and you have some protection there. But after about 3 to 6 months, then it drops down, and you don't seem to have a established immune memory that you do have with natural immunity. And of course, with natural immunity, you're making antibodies not just against the spike protein, but against the other 27 other proteins that are in the virus too, which at least some of those, like the membrane protein, can be quite protective. So when you have those health authorities that have handled this situation, and especially, for example, I don't know if you know this, Nathan, but right now, if you're in Norway or Sweden, United Kingdom, they don't recommend vaccination of children. In fact, some places they won't do it. And if you're in Denmark or Australia, Denmark, they don't recommend vaccination for anyone under 50 years of age. In Australia, anyone that's under 40 years of age. And likewise, in many of the states, like Florida, they no longer recommend vaccination of people under 40 years of age, especially men. And for the reasons that I explained at the beginning of our interview, the myocarditis is so obvious. the risks that are being put. And yet, the same people that want to consolidate the colleges for the various health professionals and have a tighter control on basically how they control the members that are in those colleges, they're the same ones that they seem to be ignoring this other data that other regulatory agencies in other jurisdictions have clearly recognized. This is where we're at. And this is why it's so dangerous to have like that bill C-36, because we can't trust our own health authorities anymore. And this to me is the biggest it's really the thing that scares me the most about all this, because it's undermining public confidence in the abilities of the health agencies to protect the general public. That if they've screwed up so badly on COVID-19, how can we be so sure about other vaccines, about other treatments? And I think the fact of the matter is there are going to be situations where we really do absolutely need to trust the authorities. It could be another pandemic in the future. It could be a certain type of therapy. And those people, having lost trust in our health authorities, may not do what's actually in their best interests. And that's what really scares me. They'll start looking at alternatives that may not be as effective. And so that's why such a tremendous degree of trust has been built up over the years in our health agencies and regulatory authorities. And they've managed to erode it in such a short order. And this is where we're at.
Yeah. On that note, so Bill B-36 is now an act. So
yes,
that is now law that any health practitioner, I believe even naturopaths and massage therapists and so on, these kinds of health practitioners also have now been literally mandated. It's now like mandated. You must be up to date, meaning getting your
vaccine shot. Yeah.
injection every 3 months. You must be getting that.
Right.
Otherwise, you'll lose your license and you'll be fired. And
right.
If you recommend anything other than that, you could be fined up to $200,000 or imprisoned for 6 months. And this is in the act. In fact, we have the Justice Center making noise about this. The Justice Center, for Constitutional Freedoms.
Yes.
It's like not a, dark web
conspiracy site. I've worked with these people, and they're very competent, and they're very concerned, and there's a case that's being considered in Ontario right now with 3 medical doctors that gave waivers for vaccination based on their patients, giving them informed to get conformed consent, and being informed they didn't want to consent. And they also reported vaccine injury. And in one case, it was considered fraud, which is interesting, because if there's any evidence that these vaccines cause some injury, it's actually incumbent upon physicians to report it, but it's very difficult, takes a long time, and most of them are rejected. In fact, in Canada, there's been an argument that there has been a single death caused by the vaccine, any of these vaccines, by the Canadian reporting system. However, in the VAERS system, we have over 30,000 deaths that are reported. Population is about 9 times the size of Canada's, and in worldwide, it's closer to about 45,000 deaths, and that is considered to be an underestimate of only about 2% of reported injuries. You can at least take those numbers and multiply by tenfold.
Yeah.
So this is the dilemma. So there was a case that was presented basically to these doctors that we reprimanded by the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Ontario. And this was, I guess, argued in the courts. We haven't got the decisions yet, but that case already had over 17,000 people actually tuned in to see the proceedings of that. And really what's at stake is that when you're a medical doctor and you have an existing drug, and this is, we're talking about ivermectin here in the case for treatment of COVID-19, you have an existing safe drug where there's evidence in the scientific literature, peer-reviewed literature, that these may in fact be effective in the treatment of a disease for which we had no treatments for the longest time. Now we have, Paxlovid, for example, and remdesivir, which has its own problems of kidney damage. But nonetheless, you have a situation now where doctors that before could prescribe a drug to their patients that was off label, but still a safe drug, they can't do that anymore. So the college made the decision in the case of BC and other places that they didn't want their physicians to prescribe ivermectin, and also pharmacists couldn't actually give the ivermectin even if they had a prescription. And yet, when you have this kind of situation, there's so much evidence that it was actually works. And this is the first time in history that doctors aren't able to prescribe medications that are already known to work well and exist. And put that into contrast to, let's say, Paxlovid, which has a safety profile, an experimental drug, it's emergency use authorization, whereas we don't know what the long-term effects of the Paxlovid is. What we do know is a significant number of the people that get this expensive treatment, $600 a shot for 5 days, they will get it again in a matter of days after they've stopped taking the treatment. So they have to do a second round of the treatment. Whereas, the ivermectin would have been, maybe $40-50 for a treatment course. So, this is where we're at. Doctors are not able to practice their craft. And now they're in a very interesting situation because they have the Hippocrates Oath, where they will do no harm to their patients. They made this oath, doesn't matter what the country is. If you're a medical doctor, you take this oath. Well, as it turns out, they may be told things from their colleges now that they'll have to actually disregard their oath. And bear in mind, after all of this, it is not illegal to prescribe ivermectin to a patient in Canada. It's not illegal. So it's not the government. There's no actual government regulations for this from the health authorities. This is coming from the colleges making these decisions. So this is sort of what's going on.
What's going on?
Yeah.
What's going on? What's going on? But Steven, I thought it was pertinent. We actually only have 5 minutes left on this. I'm gonna log us in and start a new interview if that's this is we can use all this, but just for a heads up. I was digging in here, and we've only got 5 minutes left on this. So my curiosity is, what do you think of the work of the Canadian Society for the Advancement of Science and Public Policy, CSASPP, what they're doing? Their certification is coming up December 12th through 16th. They're the furthest along in the courts in fighting the mandates that are already in place.
Yeah, no, I'm working with them already. What happened was they originally filed their affidavits but they didn't have any expert reports with it. It was more on the grounds of human right violation. And so there was a judicial review that's going on right now that they're trying to get forward. And it was just submitted. And they've asked me to be one of the expert witnesses on that. And I put together, well, my curriculum vitae, my resume goes with this document. That's about 80 pages. But there's 190 pages of other scientific data and expert report that I've submitted. There's a lot of late nights or no nights working through getting this done on time. But working with their lawyers, we have a submission going on. And there's actually, the judicial review involves, I think it's 6 cases that were all bundled together and thrown out. And so the judicial review is also with these cases bundled together. And the different lawyers are taking different strategies or tactics on this. But with this organization,
CSAS.
we're
Yeah.
CSASPP, we're trying to go now very with strong scientific basis to again take on Bonnie Henry's public health orders,
Which are based on the concept that we were in an emergency
yes,
beginning, and what this suit is doing is attacking that very premise. Were we
that's
in
right.
an emergency when 90% of people already had antibodies before the vaccine rollout,
That's right.
as you can prove?
I think the basic bottom line is that there was a number of statements that Bonnie Henry made in her public orders, both last June and in September, that can be challenged as to have no basis, or that the premise is incorrect. In her public order, she gives no scientific references for her statements that she makes that, for example, that natural immunity, we don't know how long it lasts. It's not as effective as the vaccine-induced immunity. Just a blank statements, or that we're reducing transmissibility with the vaccines when there's absolutely no scientific data in any kind of a formal clinical trial that actually demonstrates that the vaccines reduce transmission at all. So,
Yeah.
so we took her to task with that, and we're trying to get this into the courts. But they're expert witnesses. We've reputed the data that they presented. So we'll see how this goes, but it may not be resolved until early next year. But it needs to be resolved, because we can't have public officials without any sufficient justification go and make these pronouncements that have huge impacts on people's lives, from everything from their jobs to their health, and basically just the psychology of how are you affected when you're in a siege mentality, basically, for coming up to 3 years now. This is not good for our society.
This is
And
what
like
we
I
need
said,
to do to reestablish trust, right?
exactly, we need to have people fess up where they've screwed up, learn from our mistakes, and then put together the policies and the apparatus, so at the end of the day we can be more effective in dealing with these kind of public emergencies in the future, and not put people at such high risk and damage collaterally. I mean, the collateral damage from COVID-19 from the public health authority response is far worse than the virus ever was.
And we need accountability for that.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. I mean, there's victims on both sides. You have the unvaccinated people that have been victimized and discriminated against unfairly. And then you have the people who actually got vaccinated, which now they're facing all these potential health issues. So, there's a lot of victims on both sides. And that's why there has to be some accountability.
Indeed.
Agreed.